Mr. Chairman, we're live whenever you're ready.
We're live and we're ready to go. This Senate Minerals and Economic Development Committee meeting. We have three bills to talk about today. First one being Senate File 35, Electric Vehicle Charging Stations Regulation Exemption. Would anybody like to introduce that bill?
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
I'll just briefly go through. This was a simple cleanup bill that came to us where there was discussion of the possibility that the retail sale of electricity for charging electric vehicles might be something that was regulated as a public utility by the PSC, and nobody anywhere seems to have thought that was a good idea. This bill just provides that clarity unambiguously by adding that paragraph. That's the bill. Probably a good thing.
Any questions, committee? Questions of him? Anybody in the audience like to speak on Senate File 35? I think you have this in your packet.
Good afternoon, Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Rick Kaysen, and I'm representing Rocky Mountain Power. Last evening, I did forward to you via email a proposed amendment. There are some additional copies if the public would like to look at those as we've provided in years past. The recommended amendment addresses the concern that the company has, and hopefully you've had an opportunity to read what I sent to you, and we won't necessarily have to plow that ground again, but simply the concern is the bill does not address what we have known for many, many decades as the regulatory compact. And that regulatory compact is with the Public Service Commission that addresses certificated service territories. And the bill, again, the concern is the bill does not address the right of the incumbent utility to, and the obligation of the incumbent utility to provide that electricity, to sell that electricity to the owner, the operator of those electric charging stations. So what this amendment does is hopefully it addresses that concern, and it is consistent with regulatory actions with the Public Service Commission that says the public utility that has the certificated service territory has the right to provide that electricity to those charging stations, much as with a residential or a commercial customer within that service territory. So that is what I am asking for your consideration, is to be constant with that respect for the certificated service territories and the regulatory compact, the right to serve and the obligation to serve as well. And with that, sir, I will try to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions for Mr. Kaysen? Any questions? Any questions? I have a question. This does not preclude REA from furnishing that service. It's whoever's furnishing the service in that area is who they buy the electricity from. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman. To use the REA in the same vein, the incumbent utility where they have dedicated service territory, they would have the right and the obligation to serve.
Yeah, it reminds me that we're a regulated state, not a deregulated state.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Yeah. Any other questions for Mr. Kaysen? Nope, hearing none. Thank you, Mr. Kaysen.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for traveling all the way you did.
From Cheyenne, right?
Yeah. Any other comments on Senate File 35 or the proposed amendment? Good afternoon. Any questions for Mr. Taylor? Questions for Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor, wait a minute. Are you anticipating any charging stations in your service territory? Is that? Oh. Will you have a superchargers, I think they call it, that to do it in 2 hours or something like that? Oh, don't. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Taylor. You make it work?
There it goes, I think. Mr. Chairman, David Bush, Black Hills Energy, not to belabor it, but I will echo what my utility colleagues have said. Support the bill, support the amendment.
And you're already controlled under this with the gas station things with right?
Yeah, with the CNG stations, is that what you're, yeah, same concept that
Yeah.
brought this forth, I think, so.
Right. Any questions for Mr. Bush? Questions for Mr. Bush? Nope, having none.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you for being here. Any of you electric vehicle drivers out there want to chime in? Oh, there's one. There's one there.
Mr. Chairman, Bill Winnie, Sublette County. I'm not sure I'd call myself an electric vehicle driver, but my wife and I have owned a Ford Escape hybrid since 2006, 350,000 miles on it, and recently purchased a Ford F-150 Power Boost, again, a hybrid. But one of the things that comes to mind, the engineer in me would like to offer a word of caution. I know lead acid batteries very, very well from my submarine experience, and they have a strong temperature dependence with capacity. I haven't been able to find that on the internet for the lithium ion and so on, but they have to, it's a chemistry thing. They have to have the same thing. Give you perspective. A lead acid battery is rated at 80 degrees Fahrenheit. At 32 degrees Fahrenheit, its capacity drops by 50%. At 0 degrees, it drops by another 50%. And so here in Wyoming, in like February, you could run into some people with electric only vehicles that have a problem, can't get from here to there. In the case of the Ford Escape hybrid, the battery had a heater in it. So when you plugged in your engine block heater, it also warmed up the battery because that battery started the engine, not the 12-volt battery. In the case of the 2021 F-150, the 12-volt battery starts the engine. So they kind of sidestep that thing. Why is that important? I think it's going to start getting important for how closely you space those charging stations along I-80 or wherever. So just a thought for you. I just think there's something else coming. The other thing I would offer you is batteries charge exponentially, not linearly. People talk about, well, it'll take 2 hours to do this. Well, the amount of power that goes into a battery in the first few minutes is a lot greater than it is in the last few minutes because of that curve type thing. And that could get you in trouble because if everybody plugs in their car battery to charge at the same time, a utility could have a problem. That's probably not going to really happen, but just the thought. Subject to your questions. Thank you very much, sir.
Any questions for Mr. Winnie? Mr. Winnie, thank you. You always have some interesting engineering observations on every subject, and that's wonderful. Anyone else? Any other EV drivers? No, none. Is there one on the, or two on the Zoom and not in the room?
I do have them up, and
Okay.
if you would like to call on them.
Uh, That isn't Snarky, so that must be Ackley.
Yes, sir. That's me.
Ackley. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Ackley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me properly.
Well, there's some in the room who can't hear anything. So, but the ones that can hear.
I'll take what I can get, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Justin Ackley. I manage public policy and regulatory affairs for ChargePoint. ChargePoint is the largest EV infrastructure provider in North America. And I just wanted to give you a little background on Wyoming and kind of what we think is critical about this particular piece of legislation. Right now, Wyoming is one of the few states in the nation that only has a few chargers within its boundaries, approximately 200 charging ports. As you're aware, states like Wyoming tend to struggle a little bit with EV adoption because right now there aren't models available to meet the needs of EV drivers in places like Wisconsin, whether you're talking about trucks, SUVs, tractors, medium and heavy duty vehicles. However, all of this should be resolved in probably the next 2 to 3 years as OEMs begin to produce these in mass production. And by 2030, we anticipate that about 30% of vehicles on the road will be electric vehicles. So this legislation is sorely needed for Wyoming to really maintain any sort of ability to adopt EVs as moving forward. Simply put, the language just says EV charging is not the retail resale of electricity, meaning that EV charging, businesses that provide EV charging are not going to be subject to the jurisdiction of the Public Service Commission. If Wyoming were to pass this bill, essentially they'd be joining 41 other states that have already have this exemption on the books, including in the last 12 months, North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, and of course, I'm located here in Texas, so we have it down here in Texas. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, there's a deregulated market down here, so we're a little bit of a different breed, but it all kind of lines up. Basically, what is the result of this? This will mean competition in private sector investment. If Wyoming wants to kind of build out the EV infrastructure that's available to the state, this permits private sector businesses such as Loaf and Go, Fly and J, Come and Go, Big D Oil, Albertsons, whomever wants to get into the business of EV charging for their clients and customers, they'll be able to create a business model around this sort of charging. They'll be permitted to charge by the kilowatt hour, which means that they'll be charging by the amount of energy consumed as opposed to the number of minutes plugged in. And as y'all are probably aware, different levels of charging take different minutes, different hours to charge your vehicle. A DC fast charger, which is your high kilowatt hours, that can charge a vehicle in 15 to 20 minutes. A level 2 charger, which is a much lower kilowatt hour consumption, can take up to 2 hours. So if you're charging by the minute, there's just a discrepancy there. We would encourage the Senate committee to adopt this legislation to join the 41 other states. And currently there are 4 states, Wyoming, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Georgia, considering legislation just like this. We applaud the committee and the legislature for creating such a clean piece of legislation. To speak to the amendment that was proposed by, that was spoken to earlier, I just wanted to address that. I think there may be some concerns by our utility partners, RMP and Northwest Energy and Black Hills, that there may be a development off-grid solar or something along the lines in the future. We've dealt with this in other states. Other states don't have this sort of exemption in the language. We're concerned that this is a solution in search of a problem. Right now, Wyoming gets less than half of 1% of their energy from solar, and that's grid, that's residential, that's almost everything on the books. So to believe that your Flying J truck stop is going to go build a solar array big enough to power electric vehicles at 150 kW is just kind of a far-fetched idea at this point. And we just don't see the market developing in that way. Most distributors, whether it be a retail fueler or a grocery store or whomever's in the business, get those electrons from their local generator, local distributor, and it's not really an off-grid issue. So we would probably oppose the amendment, really encourage the committee to pass the bill and really put this on the books so that Wyoming really has the opportunity to address the EV revolution that's coming. And I'm happy to answer any questions from the members of the committee.
Questions for Mr. Ackley, committee? Yeah, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question for Mr. Ackley again. What were the 4 states that are considering legislation now?
Currently, there are 4 states under, so this year, actually about 2 weeks ago, South Dakota signed, the governor of South Dakota signed their legislation. So it was 5, it's now down to 4. The 4 are Wyoming, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Georgia. And they all have legislation on the books or in pending legislation right now. Within the last 12 months, North Dakota, Kansas, and Texas have all passed this legislation. Texas's law is very, very similar to what's in front of the committee today.
Thank you, sir.
Of course, thank you.
Other questions for Mr. Ackley? Mr. Ackley, I think you're kind of saying that we're a little backwards here in Wyoming.
No, sir. No, sir.
Oh,
What I'm saying is Wyoming is about to lead the way in EV adoption of trucks, Hummers, and medium and heavy duty. You just need the infrastructure to charge all that stuff.
okay, Mr. Ackley, sure. Sure, you can get out of it now. Yeah.
I appreciate your time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for joining us. Other comments from the public? Hearing none, sensing you're done. Committee will close public comment and we'll move to the bill. What's your pleasure on the bill?
Chairman, I move Senate File 35. Charging station.
There's a second? Seconded by Cooper. Moved and seconded. We have an amendment also that we probably, should we address that first or do the bill first and then the amendment? Probably should do the amendment first, shouldn't we?
Sure. About 2 pages.
Yeah, it's not going to take us very long either way. So the chairman will make a leadership decision. We're going to address the amendment. Would anybody like to move the amendment? Proposed amendment by Rocky Mountain Power. Would anyone like to move it? Move it, move it, move it. Move it. Hearing none, the amendment will die for lack of a motion. Back to the bill, Senate File 35. Let's work this bill page by page. Anything on page 1? You'd like to? Oh, do you? Okay. Oh. Good thing. Good thing. Page number 2, do you have any changes? Any changes on page number 2? And that'll do it. That'll do it. All right. I'm gonna make a decision here. We're gonna do a roll call vote on this. Yeah. Yeah. So would you please call the roll call?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Roll call on due pass for Senate File 35. Senator Beitman,
Aye.
Senator Cooper,
Aye.
Senator Rothfuss.
Aye.
Senator Wasserberger,
Aye.
and Mr. Chairman.
Yes, aye. What did that pass?
5 ayes, do
Oh,
pass.
all right. Yeah, squeak by. Who'd like to carry that on the floor? Oh, good. Was will. All right. Yeah.
Don't underestimate solid waste.
Yeah, yeah.
Hey.
Let me just go ahead and step up on that.
Ooh, wow. A volunteer. Wow. Wow, a volunteer. Next bill to come before us is Senate File 46, Solid Waste Cease and Transfer Program Funding. Would anybody like to introduce that? 2 volunteers. Wow, look at that. This is a big bill. Winnie doesn't like that.
All right, thank you, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman. Todd Parfit, Director of the Department of Environmental Quality, and here with me is Suzanne Engels, the Administrator of the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division and responsible for implementing the program. So just walking through the Senate file, page 2, line 2, section 1 simply provides a definition of terms, and there are no changes in this section from previous years. So that's pretty consistent over the years. Page 3, line 9 provides the updated program priority list with 19 remaining projects There are 8 transfer facilities at a remaining estimated cost of 8.8 million. And I will point out that under the transfer facilities is where there's the project for dead animal management. And then there are 11 closure facilities at 22.4 million estimated to complete those projects. The total estimate of remaining projects is 31.2 million. Keeping in mind that the corrective, or not the corrective action account, but the account for cease and transfer would pay anywhere from 75% to 100% of the cost of the project. So if it were 75% for all the remaining projects, that would be 23.4 million. And the 25%, which would be the responsibility for the municipality, would be 7.8 million. And that's at, if we didn't fund it at 100%. The total available funds remaining right now is 18 million. So the difference between what we have available and what's remaining in costs is 13.2 million. And then we have to keep in mind that there are 4.3 million in loan repayments that are due back. So you can add that to the available funds. And we also have in recent years experienced project coming in under budget. So we've been able to get a little bit further from down the road than what we had anticipated. We're not asking for additional funds this year. We think we have plenty to work us through the list that we have. And as we get closer to the end, we'll probably come back to this committee and revisit that. So the changes from last year include the cost estimates for Newcastle and Moorcroft were increased. And the reason they were increased was because previously they were done without an engineering estimate. We now have engineering estimates for those 2 projects. And then the only other change was the project for Rollins changed from a closure to a transfer facility. Other than that, there are no other changes. And then page 6, line 7, which is section 2, repeals the 2021 session laws, chapter 103. And on page 10, section 3, the bill would become effective immediately upon becoming law. So with that, any questions, we'll be happy to answer.
Yes, Senator Rothfuss.
Director Parfit, on the Rollins project, is that the same budget that was there before, the 780K?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
It's the same.
Mr. Farfet, they can do a transfer station for the same price as closing down the facility?
So, Mr. Chairman, I may defer to Ms. Engels to answer that question, but it's yeah, I'm phoning a friend.
Thank you, Director Parfit. Mr. Chairman, my name is Suzanne Ingalls. I'm the administrator for the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division at DEQ. The cost estimates that we're seeing come in for transfer stations are a little bit greater than that 780,000. It's typically between $1 and $2 million. However, the city of Rollins previously received funding to close their landfill, and so that's why we're changing the type of project where they'll be pursuing a transfer station.
Okay,
Mr. Chairman, follow up on that?
yes.
And one of the takeaways that I have from that, correct me if I'm wrong, is that maybe when that moves up the list, it does end up changing when you actually have some engineering done. Is that right?
That's correct.
Fair, thanks.
The other question, Mr. Perfect, what'd you say we have in funds coming back in from the interest they're paying?
So, Mr. Chairman, on loan repayments, we have 4.3 million of loan repayments that are outstanding. They're not overdue, they're just outstanding.
Okay. Any other questions for Todd or Suzanne? No further questions? Thank you. Any public input on cease and transfer program? Hi.
I think this is the 5th or 6th year that we're just testifying to say this is a good program. We support it. And thanks for your work on this.
Oh, good. Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Hessler? Questions? Any questions? Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to have everybody agree on something. Or maybe we don't have all. Any other comments, public? Is there any comments on the Zoom? I don't think there is there? Okay, all right. We'll close public comment and we'll address Senate File 46, solid waste cease and transfer. What's your pleasure?
Mr. Chairman, I move Senate File 46, solid waste cease and transfer program funding. You pass. I'll second that.
And seconded by Beitman. Okay, any discussion? You want to run through the bill real quick? Page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, page. That's it. That's all there is. Okay, all right. Sensing you're ready to vote, I'm gonna say we're gonna do a roll call vote on this bill.
Thank you,
Go
Mr.
ahead,
Chairman.
Carla.
Voting
You have
do
to say,
pass.
See?
Do pass on Senate File 46. Senator Beitman,
Aye.
Senator Cooper,
Aye.
Senator Rothfuss,
Aye.
Senator Wasserberger,
Aye.
and Chairman Anderson.
Aye.
That's 5 ayes.
So it squeaked
Do,
by.
do pass. Yes.
Okay, all right. Once more, who wants to carry this fun little bill? You heard me do it on the opening, and I have the cheat sheet for this that gives you a really good information. Didn't you already volunteer for one?
No, you don't.
You can't do two.
I'm happy to
You
do also,
can't
but
do
let's give it to one of
two.
these guys. Yeah.
All right, Cooper's gonna do it. Cooper's gonna do it. Boy, I got some volunteers this year on this committee, I'll tell you. I've got some nice cheat sheets that they gave me that really gives you some information, some interesting financial information on it. So that's what we'll do on that, Cooper. Next one up is Senate File 47, carbon storage and sequestration liability. Wow, I can't see. Okay, is anybody going to introduce this? DEQ, can you tell us about this?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Todd Parfit, Director of the Department of Environmental Quality. Here with me is Lily Barkow, and she's here to answer any of your more technical questions that you might have. She is the state's leading expert on Class 6 carbon sequestration. So this Senate File 47 was discussed a few times during the interim with the Minerals Committee, the Joint Committee. So I'll just walk through the bill. Section 1, page 1, line 14 creates a new section 3511-318, which addresses who has title to sequestered and injected carbon dioxide. Page 2, line 2 defines the term injector. And then the requirements of an injector are listed on page 2, line 7. An injector would have to have title to the CO2 that is injected into and stored underground or within a unit area. And then the injector would hold title for any injected or stored CO2 until the department issues a certificate of project completion. Page 2, line 17, while the injector holds title, the injector is liable for any damage resulting from the injection or storage of the CO2. Page 3, line 1 creates a new section 3511-319, which covers certificate of project completion, the release, transfer of title, and custody. So essentially, once all of the requirements are met, the injector can apply to the DEQ for a certificate of project completion. And then the DEQ would issue a certificate of completion only after all requirements are met, including all the requirements established in Water Quality Rules, Chapter 24, for post-injection site care and closure. There would be public notice of the application, an opportunity for public comment, and a public hearing. A certificate of public completion would not be issued until at least 10 years after the CO2 injection ends. Now, I'll just point out on that 10 years, there's been a lot of discussion around that. It's extremely unlikely that we would get to the point where we would be able to issue a certificate of completion within the 10-year timeframe. It's going to take much longer than that. All right, so moving on to page 3, line 20, a certificate of completion is not to be issued until the injector establishes to the satisfaction of the department that the injector is in full compliance with all laws governing the injection or storage of the CO2. The injector has addressed any pending claims. The underground place or pore space where CO2 is injected or stored is expected to no longer expand or poses no threat to health, safety, and the environment. All wells, equipment, and facilities to be used for maintaining and managing the stored CO2 are in good condition and maintain mechanical integrity. And the injector has plugged any injection wells and completed all reclamation required by the department. Page 5, line 6 is upon issuance of the certificate of completion, title to the CO2 and any facilities used to inject or store the CO2 without payment or compensation shall be transferred to the state. Title includes all rights and interests in and all responsibilities associated with the stored or injected carbon dioxide. Primary responsibility and liability is transferred to the state. The injector is forever released from all regulatory requirements associated with the continued storage and maintenance of the CO2. Any bond or financial assurance is released, and then the state, through the DEQ, will assume responsibility to manage and monitor until the federal government assumes responsibility for long-term monitoring. And then on page 11, line 2, and this is in addition to an existing section 313. Upon issuing a Class 6 UIC permit, the DEQ will issue a certificate that includes a statement that the permit has been issued, a description of the area covered, and any other appropriate information. The injector will file a copy of the certificate with the county clerk. Page 11, line 10, the applicant just talks about and covers the applicability of the new provisions that we just covered, the sections 318 and 319. Then moving on to section 3, page 14, line 1. And this is in reference to the Geologic Sequestration Special Revenue Account. The specifics of the use of those funds in the account would be for testing, monitoring, and long-term inspections, remediation of mechanical problems associated with remaining wells and infrastructure, plugging in and abandoning monitor wells, all future claims associated with release of carbon dioxide for geologic sequestration sites following project completion. Section 4, page 15, line 2, these provisions apply to all holders of permits for geologic sequestration and to all orders of unitization of geologic sequestration sites before, on, or after the effective date. And then in section 5, page 15, line 11, DEQ is to take all actions necessary to implement the act. The Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and the Environmental Quality Council will promulgate any necessary rules. And then the DEQ would report to the Joint Minerals Committee the status of implementation by October 31 of 2022. The effective date is July 1, 2023, except for the rulemaking sections 5 and 6, to give us the ability to initiate promulgation of rules. That's a summary of the Senate file, but I would like to point out a few other things. Is one, we've had our attorneys take a look at this after the discussions and modifications as this worked through the Minerals Committee. We've determined that the current version that's before you would have no impact on the state's primacy for Class 6 wells, underground injection wells. It'd have no impact on our rules. We wouldn't have to go back and do additional rulemaking that we spent a great deal of time finalizing with EPA. And then this provision, the Senate file, is consistent with the provisions that North Dakota has on the books. And they are the other primacy state right now. And then just as a quick update, the DEQ, or the department, has currently one application in-house that we're reviewing, and we anticipate 1 to 2 more in the first quarter of 2022. So with that, we'll take any questions.
Questions? Senator Beitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Parfit. My question's on page 2 at the bottom, where it talks about liability for damages that any stored or injected CO2 may cause. You refresh my memory, what kind of damage could CO2 cause? I mean, people have Perrier coming out of their faucet and a green patch of grass above where the stuff is stored, a lot of photosynthesis going on. Expand on that for me.
So, Mr. Chairman, if that's okay, I would have Ms. Barkow address that.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Lily Barkow. I'm the groundwater section manager of the Water Quality Division at DEQ. In regards to the question on damages that are potential damages, just changes to groundwater chemistry, mineralization of existing geology in that location. If it were to reach the surface through migratory pathways, it would have the same impacts as general carbon dioxide, any types of explosive natures or air issues.
So as far as mineralization of geology goes, are there certain formations that this would be a bad idea to put it in that would turn it basically into like concrete, or could there be some serious permanent damage to certain geological structures that would hinder future, say, oil and gas development or anything like that?
I think Wyoming, Mr. Chairman, is pretty well suited geologically to not have those kind of impacts. We're looking at mainly deep storage into saline aquifers that are below most of the oil or mineral producing reservoirs. So those mineralizations should not be a concern.
Other questions? Yes, Senator Rothers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing that came to mind and was a concern at the last meeting, I raised it, and then I think, there was some possibility for more thought on it, but it comes down to, if you do have multiple zones at different depths, isolate one, we'll say it's as you're pointing out, hopefully it would be a deep zone, but there is certainly the possibility that you would have a potential producer below a zone that was isolated, and we'll say it was certified or is being certified. So the state's taken on responsibility for a zone at a medium depth, and then somebody wants to produce from a zone at a lower depth, and effectively through permitting with the OGCC is going to penetrate the zone that has now been isolated for class 6 to produce the well from the lower zone. Have we talked that through, thought that through? How are we going to handle circumstances where you are effectively re-entering a zone that was intended to be isolated? It has met all of the standards for the isolation that are laid out here, but now it's an inconvenient disruption or barrier to production of a zone that might be below it, or even potentially above it, but might be affected if you energize the zone.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to turn to our professional geologist to tackle that, if we can.
I'm thinking, Mr. Chairman.
And then I was trying to buy you time.
And I appreciate that.
Good team, good team.
I believe there's some.
Wait, yes, Mr. Cooper. Senator Cooper would like to answer that for you. Yeah, he'd like to help you.
Senator Chairman, thank you. That's an excellent question, Senator Rosses. You do that, you address that in the well plan and the well construction. You'll be well aware that that zone is there before you drill to it. So you would probably drill to the top of it, set a string of pipe with isolation back to surface. And if it's a overpressured enough zone, you would increase your mud weight to drill through it. You may set an additional string of pipe, or if your geologic structure below there is strong enough, you can drill onto TD with a heavier weight of mud. But it's something we do every day on gas injection fields. It's easily handled. It's not a problem.
Mr. Chairman. Yeah. And honestly, I'm not as worried about the technology of handling it as the liability associated with once it's handled. If I am and remember, when we've gone class 6, we've taken it out of OGCC and we've moved it over to DEQ. We've assumed permanent liability for it, and we're operating under EPA at this point in time. So the state is saying this is parked effectively, but then maybe it's not parked anymore, because exactly what you laid out is a perfectly reasonable and plausible path forward to produce the lower zone. But now I don't want the liability anymore. So I don't know what the answer is. It is going to be a challenge, and it's a challenge that I think, based on this legislation, it may be out of your hands, because OGCC has governance authority over the production and that original operation. I don't know how they'd have to come in and work with you on it. So there's a lot that I don't understand on how that would be carried out from a liability standpoint.
Yeah. So,
Director Parfit, did that give you enough time to come up with something? No?
So, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Rothfuss, to your point, I think you're right, as we would have a plan and an application that we would be addressing and permitting through the class 6. If there were an interest in somebody to come in behind that with a class 2, we would certainly be working very closely with the Oil and Gas Commission, and as we do now. But the Oil and Gas Commission, I'm sure, can add some insight to this following us as to how they would handle such a situation where they have an applicant that wants to develop a resource that would somehow interfere with that class 6 reservoir.
Mr. Chairman, and I'll see if you have any follow-up as well, but I think we probably need more clarity in this legislation on that point. And I'm not saying that I have any problem with what's here, but I do see that as being a potential concern where providing that clarity would be useful. At the same time, I don't know that we'd be running into that problem within the next decade. So we do have a little bit of time to think about it. But we'll hear from the OGCC on the same thing, but that is something that I just find to be a viable potential future concern that might leave some questions on that long-term liability and whether there's any obligation by that producer then to absorb that liability or take on some liability as they drill through the zone. I don't know. That would certainly, at that point, it would be very discouraging. You've effectively I can't imagine a producer is going to come in and say, yeah, no, this is a really good zone below it. We're going to take on liability for all of the CO2 that was sequestered. So there's probably more there, and anybody who's interested in trying to find a solution for that, I'd encourage everyone to start thinking about how that might work. I don't even know what the right answer necessarily is if I were to start randomly drafting.
Sounds like Senator Ruth was trying to build a case for some attorney to come up with
Yeah,
some.
if we could
Yeah.
hire a team of lawyers.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. I have a question on page 14. We tell them to plugging and abandoning monitoring wells. Those monitoring wells, are they the same depth as the class 6 wells? But they are not class 6 wells, I don't think, are they?
Mr. Chairman, they are not. They are strictly there for the evaluation of migratory pathways or the movement of the plume to ensure that it's staying within the modeled position.
But they're the same depth as the class 6 wells.
They could be
Or in that
shallower.
area.
Yeah, the number of wells needed for monitoring will be based off of the model that's developed as part of the class 6 permit.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, Senator Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Perfect. This permit, is it going to require an OGCC permit as well as the DEQ permit, or is it a combined permit between the two agencies?
So, Mr. Chairman, Senator Cooper, this would be a DEQ issued permit. Now, we do, like I said, we coordinate very closely with the Oil and Gas Commission, so they would know that we would be permitting a class 6 facility, but it wouldn't require a separate permit from the Oil and Gas Commission. They would only do the class 2 wells.
Senator Rothfuss for another short question.
Well, it's on that point. You could be transitioning from a class 2 to a class 6 though, and that might be something that Senator Cooper was contemplating.
So, Mr. Chairman, that is correct. So you can have a class 2 that is an enhanced oil recovery or storage that is being currently permitted from the Oil and Gas Commission under a class 2 underground injection permit. And there's a process in statute now for how that would transfer to the DEQ to become a class 6. And that's really the Oil and Gas Commission would make a determination in conjunction with the DEQ on when it's appropriate to make that transition. It's no longer being used for the original purpose of a class 2.
Any other questions for Mr. Parfit or Lily? No, none? Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Lily and Todd. Any other public input? And before we start, I want to remind you that we're on a kind of a short schedule here. I see some of the people in the audience that sometimes takes a lot to inform us. So go ahead. Oh, sure, it's Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was excited. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, my name is Randall Luthi, Energy Advisor for Governor Gordon. Simply put, Governor Gordon supports this bill. This actually is a unique opportunity for Wyoming to support our bedrock industries, as well as open up Wyoming for business for many other types of businesses. Well, Governor Cooper, look at that. Look at that. See that? Hey, boy. I may be happy to apply for a job with you soon if I keep those kinds of, statements up. Governor Gordon has often said, burning fossil fuels isn't the issue. It's the release of CO2. This is going to be big business, not only for Wyoming industries and not only fossil fuel industries, but it could affect cement industry, Trona. Everyone is going to be looking for a place to do, using something to do with their CO2. Sequestration right now is a hot topic and will likely be because of federal policies. You actually get a better tax break if you sequester CO2 as opposed to use it for EORI. We, however, support that, think that CO2 can be used for many purposes, including EORI. But as you look at the overall energy strategy for Wyoming, we look forward to actually being the nation's leader in CO2 use and storage. Director Parfit talked about the Class 6. There's your, one of your first steps. This bill helps on the end of that process by actually setting out certainty for industries that there can be a time when the state would take over liability for CO2. Senator Beitman, I appreciated your questions about it's CO2. Why are we overly concerned? And I think that's one of the reasons that, again, Wyoming is uniquely situated to do that. These wells are designed to be very, very deep. CO2 may actually form and actually, become part of the rock. If it does release, what is the liability? There certainly could be some, but it's still CO2. It's not SO2. So something like that. So with that, if there are any questions, I'd gladly end my long conversation of telling the committee things I would like it to know.
Well, Mr. Luthy, you took that kind of personal. I wasn't thinking about you, but
Even though he's looking at it.
even though I'm looking at you.
Yeah.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Luthy? We appreciate your support and the governor's support for this bill. That's an important deal. And it's going to be an important deal for Wyoming in the future, no doubt.
And members of the committee, thank you for taking the time to look at this. And I know you give it the great attention it deserves. So thank you.
Thank you. I think he was up first. Tom?
Race is on.
Yeah.
Scale CCS projects under development. So with that, Mr. Chairman, ask for your support.
Questions for Mr. Taylor? Questions? Do you know what the size of those North Dakota projects are? Are they pretty good sized?
Mr. Chairman, I've got to claim ignorance on that. I don't know.
Okay, all right. No questions? Thank you, Mr. Taylor.
Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. My name is Tom Kropatch. I'm the State Oil and Gas Supervisor. And I just wanted to follow up on a couple of the questions that were asked of Director Parfit regarding Oil and Gas Commission involvement in the process. And, the commission would be involved even in not in the Class 6 permitting process, but there is a unitization process for pore space that much of the details regarding unitization are going to come from the Class 6 permit regarding plume size, for example, and which pore space is affected. And so obviously, as Director Parfit said, we work closely with the DEQ to get that information as necessary to be able to do the unitization of the pore space. Also regarding the question on drilling through a Class 6 site, the statutes contemplate that occurring. 30-5-501 says nothing in Wyoming Statute 35-11-313 shall be deemed to affect the otherwise lawful right of a surface or mineral owner to drill or bore through a geologic sequestration site, if done in accordance with commission rules. So as Senator Cooper said, we'd have processes in place in permitting and in an APD, for example, to control the pressures and to be able to do that safely through either an active site or a site that had been is in monitoring, longer term monitoring post Class 6 injection. So other than that, I think I'd just stand for any other further questions on the commission part of the process.
Senator Rothman.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Tom. And we talked about that briefly at the last meeting, and I appreciate that reference. The concern I have is that honestly, the moment that you penetrate under any circumstance, you penetrate that zone, you've actually basically violated the idea that it's a parked CO2 plume, right? So it's almost like you can't have both, and yet statute says, oh, you'll have both if we pass this, and therein lies the concern. So most of the time that penetration of the zone is going to go well. You're going to do a great job with the completion, and hopefully there would be no problems, but you still are definitely going to generate some sort of a pressure anomaly through that zone. If it's overpressured, you're going to have to overpressure through it. You'll create a pressure differential under any circumstance, and so the model's wrong from that point forward. It might not be something that you can't then go back and say, all right, well, we're accounting for that. But the assumption of liability was literally based in statute on the idea that we've modeled out an idea that vertically and horizontally you would not have mobility of that plume. And then the moment that through 35-501, you approve entry into that zone so that you can penetrate, that statute is no longer true, which then begs the question, where does that liability rest? So even though it says in statute clearly, and I think you're right, you would basically say, yeah, we'll permit that. We'll give you the well permit consistent with statute, which says that we can. And if you have the mineral right on that lower zone, then I'm pretty confident that you're going to say, okay, but that doesn't resolve the liability question. And do you have any thoughts on how we might resolve that appropriately? And I guess another question is, what did North Dakota do? I don't know if we know that, or maybe they just, again, they're 10 years out, so they probably don't have this problem in front of them yet. Any thoughts, Tom?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, you're correct. I think, obviously any introduction of a new well into that zone could potentially change things. I think in the application for a well in that scenario, obviously that would have to be considered. It wouldn't be a standard drilling permit that we would issue, going to some other zone that didn't have that feature in that location. So we'd have to consider that in the permitting of, not just pressures in the zone, but also coordination with DEQ on what could it do to Class 6 site. And I'm not sure what North Dakota has done. Again, this is something we have, I think, some time on to try to figure this out. Right. And we can follow up with and get information from them as well.
And Mr. Chairman, follow up on that. And I think, I hope both you and DEQ will kind of take that challenge and look into this a little bit. One thing that, if there's not something in the statute that tells you that you're supposed to take into consideration the liability of the state with regard to this class 6 well and the zone associated with it, if there's not something there, then yeah, you might look at it, but statute's pretty clear for you that what you're going to do is you're going to look at it, you're going to say, oh, that might not be good, but hey, it says in statute that I'm going to give you a permit. And we've had similar discussions over the years along those lines, because your OGCC's mission is oil and gas production. DEQ's mission has to do with the environmental considerations. And we've had this discussion before where if it's not specifically called out for you, it's not consistent necessarily with your mission. And so we get into these little conundrums where it might make a lot of sense, but you don't have the statutory authority to really weigh that in the same way that you might want to. So again, this is just something that I think it needs more work and coordination between OGCC, DEQ, and then maybe running some scenarios of what might happen 20 years from now, what might be an interest, and ensuring that our statute contemplates it in a way that gives you and Director Parfit and the DEQ at the time the authority to effectively do the right thing and know how to handle liability.
No. Yeah. Wouldn't you agree?
Mr. Chairman, we
Wouldn't
will
you
work,
agree?
we will work with DEQ to evaluate that.
Okay.
You know, the statute does say done in accordance with commission rules for protecting the geologic sequestration site against escape of carbon dioxide. That could be read as, you know, not just escape through the wellbore war drilling, but, you know, through their outer perimeter that they've permitted or you know, modeled the plume to go as well. So.
Okay. Any questions for Mr. Kropatch? Questions? No questions. Thank you, Tom, for coming down here to join us. And here comes F11.
Mr. Chairman, Brett
Yeah.
Mullane, Wyoming Farm Bureau, not asking for F11.
Oh,
Actually, sitting in support of this bill. I think establishing who has the liability will help facilitate this going forward, because unless I'm mistaken, the surface owner, unless he's severed that bundle of sticks of the pore space still belongs to the surface owner. So I think this will help facilitate it, be good for my members. And with that, Mr. Chairman, trying to be uncharacteristically brief, I will sit for any questions. Asking you to support the bill, sir.
He also seems to agree with me.
Yeah, he does. He agrees with you. Yeah, sure. Sure he does. Everybody does. Any questions?
But Mr. Chairman, in a little bit on the light side, will point out, I believe it is still snowing outside.
Oh, good.
Hence the reason we are agreeing, sir.
Okay, there we go.
All right, thank you. Yeah. Other comments? Other public comments?
And Mr. Chairman, you do have a gentleman online.
Yep.
Mr. Schnacky.
Yep. I'll do the room first and then the Zoom.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Greg Stocky with Denbury Inc.
Greg, wait, I'm going to do the room first and then the Zoom.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Got some more people in the room. Thanks, Greg.
I do want to at least remind the committee that carbon storage and sequestration is a relatively new, maybe even immature technology. And the projected closure phase for these operations will not be realized for several decades from now. So there's many unknowns. It is by definition for the long term. One federal agency has said that it's got to be for 1,000 years. So we're talking about something that's a very different beast from what we have dealt with before in this state. According to my research, there are only 3 active, currently operating Class 6 wells in the United States. Of course, there are other applications pending as well. So we have limited experience. Our comments here are really just to ensure, again, that we are thinking hard and doing this right for the state for what is probably in perpetuity for us, and that we protect ourselves from future costs that are going to cost not only the public in general, but the public's pocketbook too, potentially, for the liabilities. So starting on page 2, section C, I just want to mention that there needs to be clarity in that about the liability. Even when the injector is the operator, it is not clear about the injector's responsibility for these liabilities that may result from a leakage while they are operating, but due to the slow nature of geologic seepage, these are not discovered or do not cause damage for many years after the event, potentially after the state has assumed liability. So clarity is needed in terms of what about a historic leak that took place during the ownership of the injector, but because it's very deep, we all don't discover it too, maybe decades later, and it could cause damage. So on page 3, section B regarding the 10 years post-injection, again, we think that due to the slow nature of geologic seepage, problems or leaks may not become known until much longer passage of time. We suggest 20 years unless actual data, not modeling, but data, can prove that the behavior of the CO2 is conforming with the design expectations and is also showing a pattern of evolving towards long-term stability. A longer time period errs on the side of diminishing the risk to the state and taxpayers. Page 3, section C, and sorry, continuing on page 4, we have a little concern with sections 5 and 6. They do sound detailed, but we're concerned that the entire operation may be developed based on modeling, and that 5 and 6 could also be proven with the same modeling. But modeling, that modeling itself could be a flawed system. So we think it's important that the injector demonstrate that the actual behavior of the injected CO2 is conforming with the modeled and expected behavior. Because the whole operation is based on that model, you need to know that in real world time, it's actually working. And then again, the carbon dioxide is behaving in a stable and predictable manner because that's going to protect our interests in the future. I had concerns on page 5, section D, that were kind of raised about the private property rights. There's no clarity in this section on how the state interacts with the actual surface owner, who is the owner of the pore space, and also probably the owner of the property on which the infrastructure sits. Does that mean the state enters into a long-term lease with the property owner for the facilities at the transfer point? Does the state have to buy that property from the landowner because he is the owner of the pore space? And also, we too are concerned about the integrity of the geologic isolation. Does there need to be some kind of property restrictions to be formalized to assure that conflicting activities such as other deep drilling does not occur? And again, we're talking in perpetuity. So these are all just private property questions we have. On page 5, little 3, regarding the state assumption of liability, I've already talked about clarification regarding historic liability that occurs when the injector is operating the site, but discovered at a later date. Who then is responsible if there are damage claims for any harm from that, the state or the operator? There also needs to be specified circumstances in which the operator's liability may be reopened. These are called clawback provisions legally. It's the recovery of costs after title transfer in the case of fault by the operator, including deficient data, concealment of relevant information, negligence, willful willful deceit or failure to exercise due diligence, those are also liabilities that the state can assume if we don't protect ourselves. On page 6, line 12, we think the responsibility should be in perpetuity for the state, and the rest of that paragraph deleted about the federal government assuming responsibility. I don't see how that is true right now. It seems to be misleading the public that we're going to get bailed out in the future. We just don't know that. And I assume that we have to write this bill to protect our interests as we best know them now. Page 11, section N talks about when the property is transferred to the state, the operator should be required to provide to the state detailed information about the conditions and a long-term monitoring and verification plan, because the state has got to implement that plan into the future. We should also get from the operator all records, maps, samples, data, and other information in respect to the site if we're taking it over. And this can also be a check on potential faults that were listed earlier. And then finally, just about the geologic sequestration account in section B on page 13. It seems fairly vague right now. It seems we need to give the department more clear, quantified direction on how to figure out what fees should be paid for the long-term monitoring of these sites. I would suggest there should be costs calculated to cover monitoring activities for a good long chunk of time, 30 or 40 years post-transfer. Fees should be based on a project-by-project analysis of the actual site itself, weighing such factors as projected costs of post-closure monitoring, the number of other legacy wells in the area, which could be potential sources of leaks, the composition and toxicity of the CO2 stream, which can exist, depth of injection, so that we're really getting the funding we need based on the specific circumstances of that storage area. And then questions such as how will it be funded and the timing? Will we get a larger sum up front in order to pay for those costs that the state has to assume? There's many other questions about civil claims regarding this. Questions about, will the pooled geologic sequestration revenue account accrue enough funding to cover a catastrophic event if there are a small number of contributors? Can citizens file a claim for damages after the title and liability has been transferred to the state? And so we just think that there's a lot to clarify about this. And again, I want to say this is all about protecting us, protecting our taxpayer dollars, protecting the public of Wyoming. And I think we have time to spend, further investigation and look at some of the improvements we can make on this. Thank you very much.
Questions for Ms. Kessler? Senator Bateman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Kessler. I actually agree with you 100% that models are junk and we shouldn't be basing our legislation upon models. But unfortunately, the United Nations whole climate agenda and policy is driven by models. And this whole harebrained policy of calling CO2 a pollutant and making us go through this exercise of sequestering it and capturing it is based on models. And these models are often proven to be wrong and running hot and not based on actual data. So I'm glad to hear you say that. And I agree that we should hold off and wait for data instead of passing legislation based on models. Thank you.
Other questions for Ms. Kessler? I think that was an agreement, not a question. No other questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Kessler, have you looked at the other states that we're talking about that may have some of these already in place? Have they answered all those questions that you have?
I've particularly looked at the province of Alberta because they are another oil and gas province, and they are making a big investment in this. They are wanting to create carbon sequestration hubs. They're actually spending up to $30 billion trying to attract companies there. So I've looked at their regulations and the others as well, but Alberta's have been interesting.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Kessler.
Hi, Mr. Chairman, Shannon Anderson on behalf of Powder River Basin Resource Council. And we just wanted to thank the committee for the good work in the interim and particularly bringing in the Title 34 provisions into the bill. That was, the part that our members really cared about, is to recognize, again, the pore space ownership and how that interacts with the provisions in the bill. So that's a good piece to include. I would just caution the committee, I think, to be mindful of the points that have been raised about the transferability from class 2 to class 6 wells. I think there's a common misperception that this will be always deep, always, permanent and saline formations. And that isn't the case if we're going to transfer wells from class 6 to from class 2 to class 6. And to Senator Beitman's question earlier, I'd also remind the committee of some news articles I sent around in August before your meeting in Laramie. I'm happy to recirculate them about the Midwest school having to shut down for an entire year because of a CO2 release from the Midwest oil field. So it can happen. It's a real issue, and we need to have the right regulatory framework in place to protect the state and our citizens. So thank you.
Questions for Ms. Anderson? Question. Hearing none. Thank you, Shannon. Wow. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
It's good to see you. And members of the committee too. My name is Richard Garrett. I've been asked by the Environmental Defense Fund to offer brief comments consistent with the chairman's request for brevity. Like many in the room and around the state, the Environmental Defense Fund certainly favors any solution that contributes to our various problems, both economic and climate related. And CCS or CSS can certainly be an important part of that solution matrix, if you will. We are uncertain of this bill's origin and why its urgency at this time. We have been a leader in this field statutorily for at least 10 or 12 years now, as we mentioned in your last meeting. The department has also reported that they have one applicant already and are anticipating as many as 2 more, and that is under the present framework. So again, what is the rush? Good senator from Laramie has described some of the long-term problems that can be addressed perhaps going forward, but why not address them as best we can in front of the process rather than in a reactive way down the road. I don't want to repeat anything else that has been said already, but I do again want to stress that a lot of folks still have, concerns. And so as I did at your last meeting, I'd simply ask that this committee consider this as a very important interim topic and add more voices to this conversation. And with that, I'm glad to answer any questions.
Questions for Mr. Garrett? Questions for Mr. Garrett?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
None. Thank you, Mr. Garrett. How many more do we have to speak in the audience? We're supposed to reconvene at 1:30. And if it's all right, we'll hear from Mr. Snocki, and that'll be the end of public input, and we'll have to carry this bill over to Friday. So, Mr. Snocki, thank you very much for waiting for us. Go ahead now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Greg Stocky for Denbury Inc. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. We do support this bill. We, as we testified before, we have added carbon storage services to our company services for carbon transportation, as well as carbon or CO2 enhanced oil recovery. We think that these are low-risk projects that are going to be met by the conditions of the statute as it's being written and can be met with engineered solutions. I would point out a couple of things based upon a couple of the questions. The Wyoming has adopted pretty specifically exactly what the EPA had in the Class 6 rules with regard to post-site care, as well as also testing, not modeling, but testing that has to be done post-completion, but before operation. I would just commend the committee to take a look at that to answer most, if not all, the questions that were raised in previous testimony. The procedures that you have to go through to be able to get to the point where you can operate it are going to be extensive, and we believe are going to be protective of public health and certainly underground sources of drinking water. So we appreciate your efforts and do support the bill.
Any questions for Mr. Stocky? No? Thank you, Mr. Stocky. Thank you for joining us. I'm not going to close out the public comment time. We'll carry this over till Friday and complete it then. And maybe there'll be more public comment at that time that this may have caused to happen. So we'll carry Senate File 47 over to Friday, the 18th. Thank you. And with that,